It started with a box I shouldn't have opened, the kind of box every house has. Old photos, mismatched souvenirs, a broken watch that meant something once. I pulled it from the top shelf in the closet while looking for the guest room curtains, the ones I knew we hadn't used since we moved in. My husband asked me to help prepare the room because his ex-stepfather, my former stepfather too, though no one ever called him that out loud, was coming to stay while helping us with the kitchen renovation. He wasn't family, not anymore. But my husband said he owed him, and I nodded. That box, though, it wasn't about him, or so I thought. The photos were dusty and yellowed, stuck to each other like secrets refusing to come apart. My hands trembled as I peeled them open. One photo stopped me. An old birthday in my mother's garden. I must have been 15. He stood behind me, one hand resting too naturally on my shoulder. I didn't notice anything wrong then. But now, the way he looked at me, it wasn't parental. It was measured. Careful. Too careful. My stomach tightened. Not from fear, from heat. I placed the box aside when I heard the front door. My husband home early, balancing grocery bags and asking about dinner. I smiled, asked about his meeting, kissed his cheek, and never mentioned the photo. Not because it scared me, but because I wanted to hold it a little longer in my head. That night, I lay in bed beside him. He read on his tablet, glasses slipping. Down his nose, I watched his hand rest on the sheets, still and familiar. There was nothing wrong with our marriage. He wasn't cruel. He didn't cheat. He helped with dishes. He remembered anniversaries. But he didn't touch me unless I reached first. Didn't ask if I liked it. Didn't seem to care what I wore underneath my robe or how long I stayed in the bath. I used to think I was selfish, for wanting more, wanting to feel that edge, that danger again, even if only through memory. But now I realized it wasn't danger I wanted. It was confirmation that I was still visible, that someone still noticed. The next morning, we made the guest bed together. My husband smoothed the sheets while I folded the blanket at the foot of the bed. He told me the man would be arriving that evening and that he'd probably stay for a couple of weeks. You know how slow he is with tools, he laughed. I said nothing. My eyes wandered to the photo still lying near the closet. I hadn't put it back, hadn't dared. By sunset, I was changing the guest towels, brushing invisible dust from the corners of the dresser, checking the mirror from different angles like a woman preparing for a stranger instead of a guest. I even changed into a softer sweater, the one that clung a bit more around my chest. When I heard the doorbell, I told myself it was just habit, just muscle memory, just manners. But deep down, I knew. Something had already shifted, not in the house, in me. He arrived with the smell of cold wind and motor oil, carrying a worn duffel bag and a grin that didn't quite match the lines around his eyes. My husband clapped him on the back, like brothers do, even though they never were, and led him into the kitchen, offering coffee and asking about the drive. I stayed back for a moment at the stairs. Watching, he hadn't changed much. Broader shoulders, whiter hair, the same way he leaned slightly to the right when he walked, like he was always about to tell a secret. When he looked up and saw me, he didn't say anything at first. Just a long, almost imperceptible pause, a blink too slow, a smile too quiet. Then, a nod, not polite, not casual, a nod of recognition, like he remembered that photo too. Dinner was ordinary. We sat like 3 points of a triangle, my husband pouring wine and retelling a story I'd heard a dozen times before. I laughed in all the right places, passed the bread, avoided eye contact with the man to my right, but I could feel it. Something building beneath the table, under the surface of the clinking cutlery and polished conversation. Afterward, I cleared the plates while the men stepped outside to smoke. I stayed by the window longer than necessary, watching them. The way the older man gestured with his hands when he spoke, the way he moved a little closer when listening. None of it was new, and yet all of it made me feel newly awake. Later in the hallway, we crossed paths again. I was carrying folded towels to the guest room. He stepped aside to let me pass, but the hallway was narrow. Our arms brushed, just that, skin against skin, warm and dry and deliberate in its slowness. His voice, low and rough, followed a beat. Later, "You still wear the same perfume?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. I walked past him into the room, dropped the towels too quickly, and stayed there until my breath stopped shaking. That night, in bed, I couldn't sleep. My husband's breathing was slow and even. I turned to my side, facing away from him. My body tense, I was wearing a silk slip I hadn't put on in months. Not for him, for myself, I told myself, but it was a lie I didn't believe. The next morning, I dressed differently, chose a lace bra even though no one would see it, tightened the belt of my robe just enough to feel my waist. I noticed how my hands lingered on my skin when applying lotion, how I adjusted my hair with more precision than usual. I told myself it was routine, but my reflection looked back at me like a stranger I hadn't seen in years. Downstairs, he was already in the kitchen, alone. The morning light sliced through the blinds, casting narrow shadows across his forearms. He was making coffee. Our coffee. Using our mugs. Like it. Was his house too? When I stepped in, he didn't turn right away, just said, "There's still sugar, right side of the cabinet?" I said yes, moving closer, our movements overlapped, him reaching above, me stepping beside him, and there it was again, the soft electricity of proximity. I don't remember who moved first, or if anyone did. It felt like falling without motion. His lips were rougher than I imagined. The kiss wasn't gentle, it wasn't tender. It was full of time, of withheld moments, of things neither of us had permission to feel but felt anyway. We broke apart when we heard footsteps upstairs. Nothing was said. He stepped back, cleared his throat, and poured the coffee. I walked away with a full mug and an emptier breath. But I didn't feel guilt. Not yet. Only a pulse in places I thought had gone quiet. My hands shook as I washed the breakfast plates, but not from nerves. It was something closer to electricity. Residue from the kitchen, from the kiss. The feel of his mouth on mine hadn't left. I could still trace the pressure, the way his hand grazed my wrist, the silence that followed like a thread pulled tight. I didn't replay the moment. I relived it, breath by breath, through every clink of ceramic against the sink. By mid-morning, my husband came down in a rush, muttering about a work errand that turned into an idea, one that filled the house with casual cheerfulness I couldn't match. "I thought it'd be fun to take a drive, just us three," he said. "There's a place north of here, old furniture outlet. We've talked about replacing that awful sideboard in the dining room." He was in his usual weekend mode, upbeat, and managerial, already on his second coffee. I nodded because saying no would need a reason, and I had none that wouldn't sound fabricated. The man who kissed me stood near the kitchen door, finishing his tea in silence. He looked toward me, not fully, just the flicker of an eye, enough to remind me of everything I hadn't processed. We drove in a car too quiet for 3 adults. My husband filled the space with radio chatter and observations about traffic. I sat in the back seat next to him, our knees a breath apart. My shoulder leaned just slightly toward the window, trying to disguise the pull. Every time the car hit a bump, our legs brushed, and I had to stop myself from reacting. He didn't speak to me once, but he didn't move his leg either. That simple decision, keeping it there, letting the contact persist, spoke louder than anything he might have said. At the warehouse, I made an effort. I pointed at styles, touched drawer handles, asked the right questions. My husband wrapped an arm around my waist, pulling me into a kiss on the cheek that felt like a handshake. I smiled and let it happen, but inside I pulled away, not from him, from myself, from the performance. While he negotiated pricing with a staff member, the older man and I found ourselves alone for a moment, between aisles of faded oak dressers and 2 shiny headboards. "You always hated those sleek designs," he murmured, almost amused. It took me a second to realize he was referring to a conversation we'd had over a decade ago, before he and my mother separated, before I became someone else entirely, he remembered. That startled me more than the kiss had. "I still do," I replied, not turning toward him. His gaze lingered, and I felt it like pressure on my skin. When we got back home, my husband excused himself. Something about emails and a client who wouldn't stop calling. I went upstairs. I don't know if I needed solitude or if I wanted to avoid the other man. Maybe both. But solitude didn't come. Instead, I found myself undressing slowly. In the mirror, watching the reflection for signs of betrayal. Was it in the curve of my mouth? The flush at my throat? I slipped on my robe, the silk one I rarely wore, and lay down fully clothed atop the duvet. My husband came in an hour later and lay beside me without a word. He kissed my temple, a gesture that had once made me feel safe. Now it only confirmed the distance. Later that night, while brushing my teeth, I looked at the toothbrushes in the cup. Mine, his, and now a third one, slightly frayed, belonging to the man sleeping in our guest room. That detail undid me more than anything else. We had let him back in our home. I had let him back into me. The day my husband left for his overnight trip, the house felt different. Not quieter. He was never loud, but more spacious somehow, as if the absence of his presence unbuttoned something inside the walls. I lingered too long in the kitchen after he kissed my forehead and closed the front door, my fingers tracing the rim of my coffee mug. I didn't ask when he'd return. I already knew. I told myself the day would be like any other. I'd do laundry, answer a few emails, maybe go through the pantry like I'd been meaning to for weeks. But the air carried an undertone I couldn't name. The man in the guest room came down late, towel slung over his shoulder, hair damp, wearing the kind of t-shirt men keep for years because they fit just right after age softens the seams. We avoided each other in a dance that was too coordinated to be accidental. He poured his coffee and sat at the kitchen island while I emptied the dishwasher, both of us narrating our movements in silence. I could feel him watching, not leering, but attentively, like studying a sculpture you're not allowed to touch. "I need to get more primer," he said eventually, voice low. "Want to come with me to the hardware store?" I paused. I should have said no. I should have asked why he needed me along. But the truth was simpler. I didn't want to be left behind. In the truck, we didn't speak. The drive was short, just 15 minutes, but it felt longer with every turn. His arm rested along the window ledge, fingers tapping once in a while to the rhythm of a song neither of us acknowledged. I sat with my hands in my lap, staring out, aware of the warmth radiating between us. At the store, we walked down aisles filled with practical things. Screws, sandpaper, bolts, but I couldn't focus. Our movements kept intersecting. I'd reach for a brush. He'd reach for tape. We stood too close at the checkout. He paid in cash and handed me the receipt without looking at me. On the way back, we stopped at a roadside stand where they sold peaches and old lawn chairs. I didn't ask why. He bought a bag, handed me one, and we stood beside the truck in silence, biting into the fruit. The juice ran down my wrist, and before I could reach for a napkin, he offered me his. Our fingers touched again. I didn't pull away. Back home, I went upstairs and changed into a cotton dress. Not provocative, but thinner than usual, soft from age and frequent washing. I brushed my hair out, loosely, then pinned it back the way I used to when I was younger. Something about that felt necessary. By evening, we were sitting in the backyard. He had lit a small fire in the metal pit, and I brought out 2 glasses of wine, though I pretended it was just a habit, not a ritual. We didn't talk much. I didn't ask about his life. Now, and he didn't ask about mine, but I watched how the firelight caught the lines around his mouth, how his fingers gripped the base of his glass, how his leg shifted closer to mine on the wooden bench. Every motion was unspoken permission. "You always looked better in natural light," he said at one point, softly, eyes forward. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Something shifted again then, not outside but inside my skin. My body felt suddenly aware of its outline. My dress clung to my thigh in a way I hadn't noticed before, and I straightened my back almost involuntarily. When he rose to add another log to the fire, I stood too. I wasn't thinking, or maybe I was thinking too much. "Let me," I said, reaching for the log before he could. His hand covered mine, just for a second. But he didn't move. Neither did I. There was no noise except the quiet crackle of burning wood. I stepped back first, not because I wanted space, but because I needed. To control the rhythm, the moment wasn't over. It was only folding itself inward, like a tide pulling back before returning stronger. He looked at me once more before turning toward the house. Not a question, not a warning, an agreement, and I followed. The kitchen was already dark when we stepped inside, the only light bleeding. From the hallway lamp, casting soft shadows on the tiled floor, I closed the door behind me and leaned against it. My palms pressed flat against the wood as if anchoring myself. My breathing felt too loud. Every sound in the house was suddenly amplified. The distant tick of the wall clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of the stairs above where no one would be walking tonight. He didn't speak, just set the empty wine glasses in the sink and turned toward me, arms crossed loosely, as though he were still deciding whether to move or to leave things untouched. But we both knew we'd passed that point hours ago. I watched him lean against the counter, his body relaxed, eyes not searching but observing. It wasn't about seduction. It was about inevitability. About being two people who had already shared something physical and were now measuring how much they were willing to admit it mattered. "I shouldn't be here," I murmured. He nodded slightly, his expression unreadable. "But you are." We stood still for another beat before I stepped away from the door, the distance between us slowly dissolving. I didn't walk toward him with confidence or grace. I walked like a woman trying to outrun hesitation. He didn't reach for me. Instead, he waited, letting me close the space on my own terms. I stopped when we were close enough to feel each other's breath. My hands hovered at his chest, unsure of where to land. He placed one of his palms lightly on my waist, not possessive, not hesitant, just present. The kiss this time was nothing like the first. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't cautious. It unfolded slowly, deliberately, with a tenderness that unnerved me. His mouth moved against mine like he remembered it from before, like he had been carrying it in his memory, reshaping it each night until now. His hands didn't wander and mine didn't grip. The heat was there, undeniable, but held in restraint, in control. That tension made it more powerful than anything urgent ever could. I felt my back arch slightly, my lips part with a breath. That wasn't quite a moan, wasn't quite a sigh, just a quiet surrender. He stepped back first, his thumb brushed my cheek, and I closed my eyes for the briefest second, anchoring the feeling. "Are you going to pretend this didn't happen?" he asked. I opened my eyes and looked straight at him. No. That single word tasted like truth. I didn't owe it to him, but I owed it to myself. Later, in my bedroom, I changed into my nightgown with more intention than usual. The fabric was soft, nearly sheer, clinging where it used to glide. I applied a touch of lotion to my arms and neck, the scent familiar, amber, vanilla, a hint of something bitter that lingered. I'd worn it on our first wedding anniversary. Years ago tonight, I wasn't sure who it was for. My husband wouldn't be home until morning. I lay in bed, fully aware of the ache in my lips, the pulse between my ribs that hadn't slowed since the firelight. Sleep didn't come easily. My thoughts drifted not just to what had happened, but to how it had felt. Right, in a way that frightened me more than the act itself. This wasn't a mistake in the usual sense. It wasn't about a moment of weakness, or a drunken lapse. It was deliberate, it was mine. And the worst part? I didn't feel regret. I felt awakened. I closed my eyes and waited for sleep, knowing that the next day wouldn't undo anything. It would only pull me deeper. The morning after didn't arrive with the weight I'd expected. There was no crushing guilt, no frantic need to justify or conceal. Instead, I felt still. My body moved slower, more intentionally, as if some internal noise had finally lowered to a whisper. The house remained silent as I dressed, sunlight pouring through the blinds, catching in the folds of the bedsheets I hadn't bothered to straighten. I chose a blouse with buttons down the back, impractical but elegant, and a pair of trousers that sat just right at my waist. Beneath them, I wore a matching set of soft ivory lingerie, nothing suggestive on its own, but I knew how the fabric moved against my skin. I didn't wear it for him. I wore it because I finally remembered what it felt like to want to. In the mirror, I noticed the subtle flush that still clung to my chest, the slight swelling in my lower lip from the night before. It didn't feel shameful. It felt real. Downstairs, the house had shifted again. He was already at the table, sipping his coffee and scribbling something on a yellow notepad, his reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose, and a plate with 2 slices of toast sat untouched. He looked up when I walked in, not with expectation, just awareness. "Morning," he said simply. I nodded, pouring my own coffee and taking the seat across from him. For a moment, we sat in, Silence, no glances, no nervous laughter, just the kind of quiet that exists when nothing needs to be said aloud, but everything is felt. There was a rhythm to the day, and we both stepped into it without discussion. He returned to sanding the cabinet doors in the garage. I spent the early afternoon reorganizing the living room bookshelf, something I'd been putting off for months. It was a kind of penance, maybe. A way to make order elsewhere when none existed inside. My husband returned that evening. He walked through the door with his usual measured energy, dropped his suitcase near the coat rack, and gave me a familiar smile before kissing me on the cheek. "House looks quiet," he remarked. "I kept it that way," I replied, too evenly. Later, as he showered, I folded laundry on the bed. The scent of him mixed with my own perfume, forming a strange cocktail of what was and what had just become. I laid his shirts in a neat stack and noticed how impersonal the motion felt. It used to bring comfort. This small gesture of care. Now it felt like tidying a room I no longer lived in. That night, when we got into bed, he reached for me. Not urgently, not tenderly, just as a matter of routine. His hands moved across my skin with a practiced familiarity that made my breath tighten. I responded, because I had always responded, but my mind drifted elsewhere. I kept my eyes closed, focused on the ceiling's faint shadow pattern, and waited for it to end. After, he fell asleep quickly. As he always did, I remained still, my body cooling beneath the thin sheet, my thoughts returning to another set of hands, another gaze that didn't expect but invited. What unsettled me most wasn't the comparison, it was the clarity. There had been no lies between us, not even in silence, no demands, no explanations. And yet, I felt seen, fully, terribly seen. In the days that followed, the pattern continued. My mornings became more careful. I lingered longer in front of the closet, choosing outfits not by weather or habit, but by how they shaped me. I began applying mascara again, even if I had no plans to leave the house. I caught myself checking my reflection in the microwave door. We didn't speak about that night. We didn't try to recreate it either. But the current between us stayed, in the hallway, at the dinner table, in the way he said my name differently than before, like it tasted new in his mouth. One afternoon, while wiping the counter, I heard him behind me. I didn't turn. His voice was low. "You're not just beautiful. You're alive again." I froze, sponge in hand, unsure whether to answer. I didn't need to because I was. The note was folded neatly in half, tucked just inside. The inner pocket of his jacket. I hadn't meant to find it. I wasn't snooping. I was hanging up his coat after he'd left it draped over the back of a dining chair, still dusted with the cold from his walk to the corner store. It slipped out as I reached for the hanger, gliding to the floor without ceremony, landing face up. My fingers hesitated before picking it up, sensing the weight of words before reading a single one. It wasn't a letter, not really. More like a thought caught mid-breath, scribbled in his tight, neat handwriting, the kind he used when balancing our checkbook or listing errands on weekends. But this was different. It wasn't a list of things to do. It was a list of things not said. She barely looks at me now. Maybe I did something wrong. Maybe it's just age, or maybe I never really knew her at all. I think she's gone, but if I ask, I'll lose what's left. My chest constricted with something colder than shame, not fear, not even guilt. It was grief. He knew. Not everything, not the specifics. But he had sensed it. The slow drift, the unraveling of presence. He felt my absence even when I was standing in the same room. He felt the way I disappeared beneath routine. And the worst part? He blamed himself. I stared at the note for a long time before folding it back and slipping it where I'd found it. The fabric of the jacket felt heavier than it should have. I hung it slowly, careful not to disturb the quiet. The house that evening was quieter than usual. He made himself a cup of tea, sat by the window scrolling through his phone. I cooked dinner with my back to him, each movement painfully aware, each stir of the spoon louder in the absence of conversation. We ate without much to say, the scrape of fork against plate filling, in for what neither of us could admit. Later, I walked into the guest room, our guest room. though now it felt like a room built from shadows, and stood in the doorway. He was sitting at the edge of the bed, untying his boots, the lamp casting a soft glow against the stubble on his jaw. He didn't look up. "I read it," I said quietly. He paused. "Figured you might." I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. The walls seemed to shrink as I moved closer. "You shouldn't think he doesn't know me. He knows the version you became. For him. Not the one you locked away," he said, finally raising his eyes to meet mine. There was no accusation in his tone. No triumph, just a kind of weary certainty. The kind that lives only in people who have spent years observing others, without ever being truly seen themselves. "I should go," he added, standing now, reaching for his flannel jacket draped over the chair. "Then go," I whispered, but neither of us moved. He stood there, jacket in hand, heartbeat almost visible in the tension of his throat. I felt mine matching it, beat for beat, like two distant drums calling across an open field. Finally, he dropped the jacket, not in surrender, in decision, and I took one step forward. We didn't touch, not yet. But we stood so close the space between us felt alive. I could hear my husband's voice in my head, not angry, not betrayed, just quiet, asking me what went wrong. And I didn't have the answer, because nothing had gone wrong. Nothing had exploded. Nothing had shattered. It had only faded, quietly, softly, like steam off a morning cup of coffee left untouched too long. He reached out, brushed a loose strand of hair from my face. My eyes closed, just briefly, and I felt my whole body lean into the motion. When I opened them, again, I wasn't confused, I was certain, and certainty I realized was far more dangerous than desire. I woke before dawn, the sheets tangled around my legs, my skin too warm beneath the blanket I hadn't remembered pulling over myself. The air in the room felt stale, thick with breath and silence. I stared at the ceiling, tracing invisible cracks I knew weren't there. The kind your mind creates when it needs to focus on anything but what's inside it. He hadn't come back to the guest room after I left the night before. I had walked away. Not because I regretted it, but because the feeling inside me had grown too sharp to hold. It wasn't love. It wasn't lust. It was the terrifying clarity of standing on a ledge and knowing you've already jumped. Downstairs, I found a note on the kitchen counter, this time in different handwriting. Fewer words, but more final. "I won't be staying tonight. Give him the space he deserves. No name, no goodbye, just a decision made for both of us." I stood in the kitchen, barefoot, wearing the robe I'd once reserved for anniversaries. The tile was cold beneath my feet. I reread the note as if the words might shift, soften, offer an opening I'd missed, but they didn't. The house was unnaturally clean. No scattered tools, no trace of him in the hallway, no muddy boots by the door. The absence was surgical, precise, complete. He had taken everything with him except the tension he left behind. I made coffee out of habit, watched it drip. The sound used to soothe me. Now it only echoed. When my husband came down, I was already seated at the table, my hands wrapped around a mug that had long gone cold. He sat across from me without speaking, rubbing his temples like sleep hadn't been kind to him either. "You're quiet," he said eventually. "So are you." He nodded, his eyes scanning my face as if searching for something that used to live there. Did something happen? The words sat between us like a third person. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked at the steam rising from his cup, how it curled in the air, visible only for a second before vanishing. "Yes," I said finally, "but not the way. You think?" He didn't press. He didn't accuse. He just looked at me. Really looked. And for the first time in years, I saw a fracture behind his steady gaze. Not anger, not even sadness. "Loss. I found something," he said. "In your phone." My breath caught, but I didn't flinch. "I know." He set the phone on the table, face down. I didn't open the photo. I didn't need to. The silence stretched. I didn't offer excuses. What could I say that wouldn't insult the reality of what had already happened? "I wanted to hate you," he said, voice lower now. But all I felt was distance. Like I'd been watching you drift for years, and I never thought to reach. I lowered my eyes. My throat burned, but not from tears. From the weight of honesty we'd both avoided for too long. He pushed the phone away gently. I'll stay with my sister for a few days. And that was it. No shouting, no demands, just the clean edge of a door slowly closing. That night, I walked the halls like a guest in my own home. I paused in each room, his office, the laundry room, the guest room now stripped of him, and ended in the master bedroom. I opened drawers, not to search, but to remind myself what remained. I slipped out of my clothes slowly, folding each piece with care. The lingerie I wore wasn't for anyone else this time. I wasn't dressing to be wanted. I was dressing to feel. To remember what it meant to inhabit my body without obligation, I stood in front of the mirror longer than usual. My reflection didn't offer answers. Just a woman still beautiful, still whole, still responsible for the choices she made. No more excuses. No more pretending the line hadn't been crossed. The line was behind me now, and every step forward would be mine alone. The first morning without either of them was the quietest, not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the dense, suspended kind, like the air before a summer storm that never arrives. I sat by the window with a second cup of coffee I didn't want, staring at the neighbor's tree swaying just slightly in the wind, leaves tapping softly against one another like a conversation I couldn't hear. There were no footsteps above me, no voices from the hallway, no doors creaking open, just the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional stretch of the floor beneath me as I shifted my weight from one hip to the other. The house had shrunk, or maybe I had expanded. Too much feeling in too little space. My husband had left the previous evening without dramatics, a small overnight bag, a folded shirt draped across his forearm. He said he needed time, but I knew he needed distance. I didn't argue. What could I offer him now that wouldn't come across as a diluted apology? He had every right to step away from a house that no longer offered truth, and the other man, the one who hadn't belonged in this house to begin with, had taken even less with him. No note this time, no warning, just an empty guest room and a cup in the sink that hadn't been rinsed. I stood over it longer than necessary, staring at the small ring of coffee at the bottom like it held something he hadn't said aloud. I didn't cry. Not because I didn't feel anything, but because I felt too much, too differently, too all at once. I spent the afternoon moving through the house barefoot. I opened the linen closet and refolded the towels, reorganized the spice rack, throwing out expired jars I hadn't used in years. I paused over a bottle of rosemary I'd bought on a trip my husband and I had taken when everything still felt new. It smelled like nothing now, dull and dry. That evening, I poured myself a glass of wine I didn't finish. I walked through the sea. Backyard, the grass slightly damp under my feet, the hem of my dress catching dew and dirt. The fire pit still stood in the corner, blackened from that last evening. The wine, the bench, the heat that had lingered longer than the flames. I sat there for a while, arms around my knees, chin resting lightly. It wasn't regret that sat with me. It was weight. The weight of being seen, and then left. The weight of having crossed into something irreversible and still not knowing what to do with it. I thought of what he said once, not long before the first kiss. "You're not just beautiful, you're alive again, was I?" Maybe I was, and maybe it didn't matter. Aliveness wasn't a reward, it was a risk, and sometimes it came too late to change the course of what was already in motion. When I finally returned inside, the house was still. The walls didn't echo. The lights didn't flicker. Everything was in its place, too much in its place. I went upstairs, peeled off my clothes, and stood naked before the mirror, not to admire or criticize, just to witness. My skin was mine again. Not his. Not the other's. Mine. I put on my oldest nightshirt, the one with a hole in the side, and climbed into bed alone. There was no one to reach for, no breath beside mine. But for the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to disappear beneath someone else's touch to remember who I was. I lay there quietly, letting the silence take its shape. And I slept.